identification under Senate Bill 824. And I believe your testimony was that you know a lot of such people. Did I understand that correctly?
Objection, mischaracterizes prior testimony.
Give me 1 second, please. The objections are. Answer.
Yes, what I indicated is if you, based on some of the pieces in Senate Bill 824, that I do know people who don't have driver's license, who don't have state or federal IDs, or who don't have some of the forms of ID that are listed in there. I did indicate that.
And you recall giving a deposition in this case, correct?
Yes.
And you understood that you were under oath and you did your best to tell the truth in that deposition, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall being asked at that deposition whether you personally know anyone who is registered to vote that lacks an acceptable form of identification under Senate Bill 824?
I do recall at being asked, did I personally know people, anybody? I do recall that.
And do you recall what your answer under oath was at that deposition?
I probably said that I didn't personally, but that I do know people in my district who do not have acceptable forms of ID.
I see. So you don't personally know anyone, but you're distinguishing between having a personal relationship and just knowing somebody in the community generally. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, the fair characterization is that I represent a district of people, and all of them are my constituents. They may not be my personal friends, but they are my constituents that I represent, and that's my answer.
Do you also recall the questions on direct related to statements that Senator McKissick made on the floor of the Senate that were complimentary of the Republican leadership and the process of passing Senate Bill 824?
I do recall looking at the record, and what I can't tell you verbatim what he said. I just indicated, the intent, I thought.
And please correct me if you think this characterization is wrong, but I understood you to believe that was how he would generally behave because that's what he typically does and is that sort of a gentleman. Is that a fair characterization?
I indicated that Senator McKissick's mannerism on the floor is normally one of a gentleman, very courteous, that kind of thing, and appreciatory regardless.
Did Senator McKissick make similar complimentary statements to the Republican leadership during the passage of the prior voter ID law, House Bill 589?
I cannot tell you that. I am not looking at the transcript, so I cannot say that.
You're not able to offer an opinion on the intent of the individuals who voted in favor of Senate Bill 824, correct?
I indicated it at the beginning. I'm not speaking for any individuals other than me.
And you don't know what the intent was of the North Carolina citizens who voted to amend the Constitution to require photo identification, correct?
I am not sure anybody could say that.
You don't think that Senator Ben Clark intended to target and harm members of any particular racial group when he voted in favor of Senate Bill 824 in the second reading in the Senate, correct?
I don't know Senator Clark's intent. I can't speak for Senator Clark.
Okay. Do you have a view as to whether he voted in favor of Senate Bill 824 in the second reading in the Senate to target a particular racial group?
Would you say that again?
Do you have a view as to whether Senator Clark voted in favor of Senate Bill 824 on the second reading in the Senate to target a particular racial group?
Objection asked and answered.
One second, please. The objections are moved.
So I cannot state Senator Clark's intent, and I certainly will not slander his character.
Do you believe that it's possible that Senator Clark voted in favor of Senate Bill 824 in the second reading in the Senate in an effort to entrench a Republican majority?
I don't know Senator Clark's intent.
Do you think that Senator Don Davis intended to target and harm members of any particular racial group when he voted in favor of Senate Bill 824 in both the second reading and on the third reading in the Senate?
I cannot speak for Senator Davis, and I do not know his intent.
Were Senators Clark and Senator Davis on the outs with the Black Caucus or the Democratic Caucus at that time?
At which time?
When they voted in favor of Senate Bill 824, Senator Clark on the second reading and Senator Don Davis on the second reading and on the third reading upon amendment by the House?
I don't know what you mean by outs. You said.
Were they caucusing? Was Senator Don Davis and Senator Clark caucusing with the Democratic caucus in the fall of 2018?
Senator, if I remember, Senator Davis was an officer, if I recall correctly. And I think both were participating.
And were either of those two senators members of the Black Legislative Caucus?
That's the caucus to which I refer.
Okay. What about the Democratic Caucus? Were they members of the Democratic Caucus and caucusing with the Democrats?
Yes.
And based on the timeline for the passage of Senate Bill 824, it appears to you that the intent of the Republicans in the General Assembly was to get the law passed while they still had the majority necessary to override a veto by Governor Cooper, correct?
Yes.
And you don't recall anyone saying anything to you that would support a conclusion that racial discrimination was the intent of the leadership of the Senate, correct?
What do you mean, anyone? Do you mean legislators? Who you're saying, general public? Who?
You don't recall. Well, let me ask you this. Do you recall being asked at your deposition whether anything said to you, was there anything said to you that would support a conclusion that racial discrimination was the intent of the leadership of the Senate?
I don't recall legislators, if you mean Republicans or whoever, but there was discussion in the community with the NAACP, those folks that I interfaced with.
Okay. If we could pull up your deposition transcript. I'm going to direct you to page 133. And I'm going to have us zoom in on lines 6 through 12. Senator Robinson, can you see that document on your screen?
Yes.
Do you see where you were asked at your deposition, was anything said to you that would support a conclusion that racial discrimination was the intent of the leadership of the Senate? And you responded, was anything said to me by whom?
Your Honor's objection, I believe this is incredibly inappropriate impeachment because the question asked by Ms. Moss was, did anyone say to you? And Senator Robinson answered honestly and truthfully under testimony here today. This is a different question.
Give me just one second, please. The objection's overruled.
And at your deposition, so I'll go back, Senator Robinson, you were asked whether anything was said to you that would support a conclusion that racial discrimination was the intent of the leadership of the Senate. You responded with a question, was anything said to me by whom? The answer was by anyone. And your answer was, I don't remember that discussion from anybody in terms of that. That was your under oath testimony at your deposition, correct?
I see that, but what is my question, I would refer to what the discussion was prior to that time. And the discussion, if I remember correctly, was about the legislative process. And I believe if you want to scroll back, we can see that. I believe it was about the legislative process and was anything said to me by anyone in that setting. If you want to scroll back.
Senator Robinson, your counsel can certainly do that if she believes that that would be helpful. But in terms of your testimony here today, do you have an opinion as to whether anyone in the Senate voted for Senate Bill 824 with an intent to discriminate against any racial group?
This is not the same question you're asking. What's your question now?
My question is, as we sit here today, do you have an opinion as to whether anyone in the Senate voted for Senate Bill 824 with the intent to discriminate against any racial group?
My opinion today is that the legislators who authored, who sponsored, and I could be specific because they've done it since, have an intent to discriminate against African Americans or to disenfranchise the vote.
And that would include Senator Joel Ford, correct?
I said legislators, and I would be, I am not targeting Senator Ford. I am saying that the intent of the legislation is discriminatory. Senator Daniel has sponsored that. He sponsored some legislation since, and Senator Kralvik has recently sponsored additional legislation on election integrity. And there are several examples of those.
Okay, but I believe your statement was that the legislators who authored and who sponsored have an intent to discriminate against African Americans. And you would agree that Joel Ford was one of the sponsors of this legislation, correct?
He is.
And Senator Robinson, it's your position that it is not possible to have a voter identification bill that is not racially discriminatory, correct?
I believe I said before, and it is based on my history and based on my experience, that the intent of voter ID is discriminatory, the intent, and that it will be very difficult to develop a bill that will make sure it's inclusive as opposed to exclusive and discriminatory for African Americans.
And again, so and it's your opinion that you have previously expressed that it's not possible to have a voter identification bill that is not racially discriminatory, correct?
I just told you what my opinion was. I said my opinion is that it is extremely difficult to do that, since the Constitution also has discriminatory pieces in it that we need to address in North Carolina, that it is very difficult. And those are discriminatory practices in the Constitution. So it is very difficult unless we put comprehensive work into cleaning up legislative language and statutes.
If I could have one moment to check my notes, I'd appreciate it. That's all the questions I have for Senator Robinson at this time. Thank you. Thank you for your time, Senator.
Thank you.
Mr. Cox, you may cross-examine the witness.
Hello, Senator Robinson. This is Paul Cox for the Attorney General's office. I don't have any questions for you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Ms. Riggs, are there any redirect questions?
Just two quick items, Your Honor. Senator Robinson, do you remember being asked by Ms. Moss in her cross-examination of you whether there were provisions in Senate Bill 824 that got rid of the last Saturday of early voting?
Yes.
Do you recall whether there was a separate bill passed in 2018, Senate Bill 325, called the Uniform Hours Early Voting Law that eliminated that Saturday of early voting?
Yes, I do now. I knew there was something that had been done, but I could not cite it without looking at documents.
And Senator Robinson, did Senator Davis and Senator Clark ultimately vote to sustain the veto and keep Senate Bill 824 from going into law?
Yes, they did.
No further questions.
I have no further redirect or further cross, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cox, I don't assume that you have any questions.
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. Senator Robinson, thank you very much for being here. You are now free to leave the virtual courtroom.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Ms. Riggs, who will be your next witness?
Thank you, Your Honor. The plaintiffs, my colleague David Giller, will be recalling Dr. Ariel White to finish her testimony.
Okay. Can we let Ariel White into the courtroom? All right, Professor White, can you hear me?
Yes, Your Honor, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I can hear you as well. I believe that when we stopped your testimony, you were being cross-examined by Mr. Thompson. Is that correct?
That is my recollection, yes.
Mr. Thompson, are you prepared to resume your cross-examination of this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Thank you so much, Your Honor. And welcome back, Dr. White. Thank you for coming back. I've been able to streamline some of these questions, so they're just a few to wrap up. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the survey of the performance of American elections. You relied on that for 2014 and 2016, is that right?
Yes, I refer to both years in my report.
And in 2014, there were 1,000 North Carolina voters. Is that right?
In the oversample, that's correct.
And then there were 744 who voted in person or at early voting. Is that right?
That sounds right to me. It's at least very near the number I mentioned in my report.
And then there were 22% of those who reported showing an ID when they voted in 2014 in North Carolina. Is that right?
Yes, photo ID. Yes, that's right.
Photo ID. Okay, thank you. Now let's turn to 2016. There, the survey in 2016 surveyed 200 North Carolina voters. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, and 165 of them reported voting early or in person. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's right.
And again, nearly 20% of them reported showing photo ID when they voted. Is that right?
That is my recollection from the report.
Okay, switching gears a little bit, there was a state survey of County Board of Elections experience in issuing free IDs. Is that right?
Yes, I refer to it in my report.
And as a result of that survey, the state board now has additional information about the experience that the county boards had in issuing free IDs. Is that right?
I believe it does have some additional information about what those county offices reported. Yes.
And it's reasonable to assume that the state board will use that additional information to try to improve the process of issuing free IDs in the future. Is that right?
I don't have particular information about how the responses to this survey will be applied in future.
But don't you think that's a reasonable assumption that the state board would take the survey results and try to improve the process?
It is possible, but I have no information about what that will look like in the future.
Okay, now let's talk about voter confidence. You acknowledge that there's some evidence that positive experience of election administration is associated with higher voter confidence in elections, correct?
Yes, as I note in my report, some types of election administration, like shorter wait times, for example, are associated with higher levels of voter confidence. We don't see that same pattern with, for example, the presence of voter identification laws.
Well, it's at least possible, theoretically, that someone who goes in and shows a voter ID comes out with a higher degree of confidence in the integrity of the electoral system, isn't it?
It's possible that some people theoretically could have that reaction. It's also possible that people could have the opposite reaction. But I note that in the context of states having or not having voter identification laws, we don't see differences in citizen beliefs, such as, for example, about the prevalence of voter fraud.
You survey 3 studies in your report that look at the relationship between voter confidence and voter ID laws. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's right.
And is it right that only one of the 3 looks at states and the level of voter confidence before and after a voter ID law is adopted?
Let me think through the studies. I believe that the Stewart and Salivera and Pursley paper does that, yes.
But the other 2 do not, is that right?
I believe that's correct.
And in the Stewart study you just referenced, there are only 2 states that are looked at that went from having no voter ID to having a voter ID. Is that right?
Over the period of the surveys they're looking at, yes, that's correct. And they see essentially no change in voter beliefs about elections in the wake of those changes.
How long had those changes been in place during the study?
I don't recall.
Were all 3 of the studies national studies?
They relied on a variety of survey data. I would have to look back at each of them to verify which survey was covering which sample, but at least several of them did include nationwide surveys, yes.
How do these studies control for confounding variables like demographic, cultural, and political differences between the states themselves?
Well, it depends on the particular analysis within the particular study you're looking at, but when they are relying on surveys, they often have information about the individual demographics of survey takers and are able to include information about things like partisanship, for example.
Did they make any effort in these 3 studies to try to hold constant for cultural differences between states?
I don't recall them looking at cultural differences in particular or how exactly, it's not clear to me how your question anticipates that they would quantify that. But I will say that in order for cultural differences to yield the kind of pattern that I think your question has in mind, which is that we wouldn't see a relationship between voter confidence or voter beliefs in elections and the presence of voter ID laws across states, but that there would be some true relationship that we would not see that would be obscured by the bias introduced by cultural differences, for example. We would have to consider a fairly complicated set of scenarios to lead to the null effects that we see here. It's not an obvious scenario to me that we would see that.
Let's switch gears and talk about voter fraud. In your view, though there are isolated cases of voter impersonation fraud, there is no evidence to suggest that it is a serious threat to the functioning of elections, either nationally or in North Carolina. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Is it your opinion that North Carolina should only take steps to combat voter fraud if it poses a serious threat to their election integrity?
Well, I guess I'm not sure quite what your question is envisioning in terms of the steps that the state would take to combat voter fraud. But when considering those steps, I would hope that the state would consider both the potential benefits, whether those efforts would actually manage to combat voter fraud, and also other potential costs associated with those steps, such as potential burdens placed on voters.
And also the threat to the integrity of the electoral system, correct?
To the extent that any given step would in fact help to make that difference, sure.
Is it your opinion that North Carolina should take steps to combat voter fraud only if fraud is widespread enough to change the outcome of an election?
No, though, again, I would say it would depend on the particular steps being taken and whether we anticipated that they could, in fact, successfully reduce fraud, as well as what other costs or changes they would impose.
Now, you've said that not all cases of voter fraud, or even of voter impersonation fraud in particular, would be preventable by voter ID requirements. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Is it your opinion that North Carolina should adopt policies to combat voter impersonation fraud only if those policies will eliminate all such cases of voter fraud?
Again, I would wonder about both the possibility of those laws to in fact combat voter fraud and also about what other changes they would introduce to the system of voting. So the costs and the benefits that the state would face there.
But one benefit would be if North Carolina could identify a law that would eliminate some voter fraud, that would be a benefit, even if it doesn't eliminate all the voter fraud, correct?
Potentially to be weighed against other considerations in the election administration process.
In preparing your report, you reviewed some details of a ballot harvesting ring in North Carolina's 9th Congressional District in 2018. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And you agree that there is a hypothetical scenario in which a voter ID law could make ballot harvesting more difficult. Is that right?
It is theoretically possible, though, as I said in my deposition, I think not the only scenario that could occur under a process as laid out under SB 824. But one could could come up with a hypothetical scenario in which it is theoretically possible that someone could potentially be deterred from the kind of steps we saw under NC9 or
And
in the
what's
NC9 case.
my apologies. One such hypothetical scenario would be if the harvesting ring is working with someone who had not submitted their photo ID when they requested the absentee ballot. Then, as a result of the law, the ring would need to collect a copy of their ID, correct?
My understanding under SB 824 is that someone voting via absentee ballot would need to either provide a copy of their identification at the time they requested an absentee ballot by mail, or at the time that they were submitting that absentee ballot, or that they would need to go through the process of providing an affidavit describing why they did not provide that copy. And so it is possible that at that second stage, if someone hadn't provided either of those things the first time around, that at the time of returning their absentee ballot, they would need to include either that copy of their ID or that affidavit. And so if someone wanted to collect their ballot in order to tamper with it, for example, they would need to help them do that process.
Do you think it's important for the state of North Carolina to know the actual identity of those who cast ballots in the state's elections?
I think that can be a useful part of election administration.
And it's essential. It's more than just potentially useful. It's essential to know who the people are who are voting, right?
I mean, I'm not sure what your question anticipates about how we would get to a place of complete knowledge of everyone who votes in every detail.
But it is for the state of North Carolina a legitimate interest to want to know who is casting ballots in its elections, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you would agree that in the abstract, if it is possible for the state to determine the exact identity of a specific voter without additional efforts or costs, that would strike you as a useful thing, correct?
Yes, all else equal, if we assume that there are no other changes made to the system of voting. Yes.
Now, predicting voter turnout is something that turns on many, many factors that can play a role in voter turnout. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And so studying the effects of voter turnout is very difficult. Is that right?
Sorry, could you please repeat your question? The effects of voter turnout?
So studying the effects of policies on voter turnout is difficult, correct?
Generally, yes, though there are a variety of designs intended to do so.
Your Honors, I have no further question for the witness. Dr. White, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Mr. Cox, do you have any cross-examination questions for this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may
Hi, Dr.
proceed.
White. Thank you, Your Honor. Hi, Dr. White. I'm Paul Cox with the Attorney General's office here in North Carolina. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you. Good morning.
And for the record, I'm representing the state of North Carolina and the State Board of Elections. I want to ask you a couple questions about the conclusions you draw about potential implementation problems of the photo voter ID law. You testified in your direct examination that you considered materials produced by the State Board of Elections associated with the implementation of the photo ID law in drawing your conclusions. Is that right?
Yes, I believe that's right.
I want to pull up a couple of exhibits. So I will share my screen now, and bear with me. It may take me a little time to just get the right one up. This is going to be JX 735. Do you see that on the screen now?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and you see that it's labeled North Carolina Preparing for Voter ID in 2016, NC Directors Conference 2015, NC State Board of Elections. Do you see all that?
Yes, I do see that.
Have you seen this presentation before?
I don't recall whether I've seen this particular presentation before.
In North Carolina, at the county board level, the administration of elections is managed by a director of elections, right?
I'm sorry, I believe I had an internet blip and I didn't hear the end of your question. Would you mind repeating it?
Sorry, my question was a little confusing anyway, but my question was that in North Carolina, at the county level, where elections are administered, the county board has a director of elections who manages that county board office, right?
Yes.
Okay, and you see the title on this slide indicates that this was a presentation made to directors of elections.
Yes, it says the NC Directors Conference.
Okay, and I'm gonna, and it says 2015, right?
Yes, it does.
This would have been the year before the first time that voter ID was enforced in an election, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so I'm gonna go to page 13 of this. Do you see here where it says in the slide, well, the slide generally refers to the ability of voters to use a reasonable impediment declaration, right?
Yes, I see that bullet point.
And do you see the last bullet point where it says no eligible voter will be turned away or not allowed to vote because of the photo ID requirement, exclamation point?
I do see that.
And do you also see the second note below the slide where it says any voter that presents to vote in person and is unable to provide an acceptable photo ID will be notified of several options?
Yes, I see that note.
Now, you had testified that you haven't seen this document before, so in forming your opinions, you didn't consider the fact that the State Board of Elections had instructed county board directors that voters must be identified of their options if they do not present acceptable photo ID.
No, to be clear, I testified a moment ago that I didn't recall whether I had seen this particular presentation. I did indeed review materials in which the state indicated this particular fail-safe process and the idea that no eligible voter would be turned away. So this is not, I would say, changing the information I had at the time that I wrote the report. And it doesn't change as well my understanding of what ultimately happened on the ground, which is that some eligible voters were turned away or unable to cast valid votes when this policy was implemented.
Okay, I'm going to go to page 14 now. And I'm just going to point you to the note at the bottom of the page where it says, we want to emphasize that in all caps, no one will be turned away or not allowed to vote, in all caps, for not having a proper photo ID, 3 exclamation points. You see that?
I do see that statement and its exclamation points, yes.
But you did not review this or consider this in forming your opinions in your reports.
Again, I don't recall whether I saw this particular presentation, but I did see materials from the state indicating this language about eligible voters having this fail-safe option such that they should not be turned away or not allowed to vote for lack of proper photo ID.
Okay, I'm going to also pull up another joint exhibit. This is 933. Do you see that? Did the exhibit change to JX 933 on your screen?
Yes, I see that label.
Okay, thank you. And do you see that this is appears to be a slide presentation, another slide presentation regarding voter ID from February 1, 2016?
Yes, I see that.
And one of the presenters is labeled as Kim Westbrook-Strack, Executive Director.
Yes, I see that as well.
And your understanding is that at this time in February of 2016, Ms. Strack was the Executive Director of the State Board of Elections.
That is my understanding, yes.
And February 2016 would have been a the month before the first implementation of photo ID in North Carolina, right?
Yes, that's right.
Have you seen this presentation?
I again don't recall whether I've seen this particular presentation.
Okay, I'm going to move down to the third page of this to see if you have seen this, just ask you similar questions. Do you see this slide where it says SBE has translated all the sources of authority into comprehensive training tools?
Yes, I see this slide and it looks familiar to me.
Okay, oh good. And so do you see where it lists comprehensive video training series?
Yes, I do.
And below that, a tabletop NC voting site station guide?
Yes, I do.
And then a train the trainer presentations and webinars?
Yes.
So among the items listed on this page, which of these items did you personally review?
I reviewed the state's description of its production of the video training series, as well as some descriptions in, I believe, materials from former Director Strack about what was in those videos and some, for example, stills of the videos themselves. I believe, let's see, I reviewed the tabletop station guide, as well as the elections handbook. And I don't believe I watched the webinars, though I was aware of their existence.
Okay, and just to clarify your answer, you reviewed information about the videos, but you did not actually view the videos.
I believe that's correct, yes.
And you reviewed information about the webinars, but you did not actually review the webinars or training materials themselves.
I don't believe I watched the webinar presentations, no.
Okay, and you said that you did review the station guide. I've reviewed your expert report, and I think you cite to a station guide in there, but it appears to be a station guide from 2016. My apologies, from later than when photo ID was implemented. Is that right? Or did you review the station guide that was in effect for voter ID?
I don't recall the exact citation in my report. I would have to go back and look to that.
Okay.
I have seen the tabletop station guide, but I don't recall whether I substantially relied on it at the time I was drafting my initial report and what citation I have in there.
And a tabletop station guide, just for clarity, this refers to a manual that is available at the polling site for poll workers, right?
That is my understanding of its intended use.
And it's called tabletop because it's, held in a binder, and the poll worker can go to the table and flip to the section that the poll worker needs to find for guidance on the voting process.
Yes.
I'm going to pull up exhibit. This is another joint exhibit, 736. Is 736 showing up on your screen?
Yes, it is.
And you see that is labeled as the NC voting site station guide, revised 2015, correct?
Yes, I see that.
Is this the station guide that you reviewed for your report?
Again, I would have to look back at the citation in my report, but I have seen this station guide.
Okay, so I'm going to go to page 28 of this document. Do you see where it lists check-in procedures?
Yes, I do.
And you see where the very first check-in procedure says, ask voter to show acceptable photo ID.
Yes, I see that.
I'll just ask the question again, maybe a little bit differently now that you've seen this page. Does this look like the station guide that you reviewed, looking now at the check-in procedures page?
Again, I have seen the version of the tabletop station guide that was used during implementation. I do not recall whether that is something I cited in my report, because I don't recall the context in which I cited in my report. I would have to look back, but this is a version of the tabletop station guide that I have seen.
Okay, and I'm going to go to page 83 now. Do you see, actually, I'm going to back up a little bit so just so you know sort of where we are in the station guide. I'm now on page 80. Do you see on page 80 where it says, "Welcome to the help station"?
Yes, I do.
And do you see at the bottom of the slide where it labels the page as help station, indicating that it's in the help station section?
Yes, I see that.
Okay. And your understanding of the voting process in North Carolina is that first a voter goes to check in, and if there's a problem with the voter's registration, or in this instance, ID, they are referred to the help station for further assistance, correct?
That is my understanding.
Okay. So in this section of the tabletop station guide, I'm going to go to a page within the help station section. This is page 83 of the PDF. And you see that at the bottom of that page, it still says help station. It's page 4 of the help station section of the manual.
Yes, I see that.
Okay. And this is a slide about provisional voting reasons, correct?
Yes, I believe it lists several of the possible reasons that voters could be casting a provisional ballot.
Okay. Now, again, looking at this slide, do you recall whether this is the station guide and these are the materials you reviewed in drawing your conclusions about the implementation of photo ID in North Carolina?
Again, I have seen this version of the station guide. I still do not recall in what context I characterized the station guide or cited it in my report, and so I can't speak to that citation.
Okay. I'm going to move a little bit further down the help station section to PDF page 90. This is, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, still part of the help station section of the tabletop station guide, page 11 of the help station section. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And this is a slide that, as its title suggests, is about provisional voting when someone does not present an acceptable ID, right?
Yes, that's right.
And the slide indicates that this is what the poll worker is required to notify that voter about, right?
Yes, that's my read of the slide.
Okay. And in bold print, it states there, any voter who does not present acceptable photo ID in accordance with North Carolina law must be notified of the following options, and must be notified is underlined, correct?
Yes, and my recollection of the materials in the tabletop guide are that they also provide proposed language that poll workers could potentially use to convey these notifications. That said, we seem to have seen variation in how reliably poll workers did so.
I'm going to pull up, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to pull up your report so that we can refer to the station guide references there. This is JX 692. Is this your report that you presented for this case?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And I'm going to go to, well, let me ask you this question. At the end of your report, you list the materials you relied on in drawing your conclusions, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that's after conclusion, so I'll see if I can quickly go to it. Okay. This is Appendix B of your report, and this indicates the documents that you relied upon for your opinions, right?
Yes,
Okay, and the first section is articles,
yes,
and then affidavits and transcripts, right? And bait stamp materials and additional materials, and I think that's the end of it, right?
yes.
Now, I see in additional materials here that you reference the election official resource guide number 5. Is that the station guide that you relied on for your report?
I would not have called that a tabletop station guide. As I said, I don't recall whether I cited or substantially relied on the details of the tabletop station guide in place in in March 2016 at the time I drafted this report, or whether I reviewed it in greater detail later. But these are the materials that at the time I drafted the report, I recorded as having relied on in undertaking my analyses.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. White. I have no further questions.
All right, is there any redirect, Mr. Giller?
Some brief redirect.
All right.
Dr. White, during your cross-examination, do you recall being asked about one of the voter affidavits you relied on, specifically Ms. Ezekpe?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall that Mr. Thompson asked you whether you knew that she was not legally entitled to vote? Do you recall that question?
I do recall that question.
And you stated that you didn't recall whether she described the timing of her attempt to vote and whether she was actually attempting to register. Is that correct?
I do remember that, yes.
I would like to show you what has previously been marked as PX26. This is the affidavit of Ms. Ezekpe. Ashley, if you could bring that up, please. Dr. White, is this the affidavit that you reviewed while drafting your report?
Yes, it is.
I would like to direct you to paragraph 5. It states that I decided to go to early voting and arrived at an early voting site with my Georgia driver's license and my Duke student ID. I went just days before the end of the early voting period. My photo was on both identification cards. The polling staff told me that these documents were insufficient to satisfy the North Carolina voting ID requirement that was in place at that time. Does this refresh your recollection as to whether or not she was attempting to register?
Yes, it does.
No further questions at this time.
Mr. Thompson or Mr. Cox, do you all have any other questions of this witness?
No, Your Honor, I do not at this time. Thank you very much.
Neither do I. Thank you, Your Honor.
Ms. White, thank you very much for being here. Your testimony now being concluded, you are free to exit out of the virtual courtroom, okay?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Ms. Riggs, who will be the plaintiff's next witness?
Your Honor, we have a couple of options for you and I'd like to get your guidance on this. We can either start playing the Karen Brinson Bell video designations before lunch, or we could take an earlier lunch and start with a live witness, Ms. Kate Fellman, right after the lunch break.
How long would it take for you to get the live video deposition up and running?
Oh, it's ready to go, but it's a long video. It's over 2 hours. It may be preferable to not break it up that way.
Or if it's 2 hours, maybe it would be preferable.
That may also be true. I think it will just take a couple of minutes to get teed up.
I'll leave it up to you. Which would you prefer? We could start now and do, roughly 15 minutes of it, or we could break for lunch early and maybe come back 15 minutes early. It really, I'll leave it up to you.
I think we would prefer to come back 15 minutes early and start with the live witness to get the witnesses' obligations to the court done.
Okay, that's fair enough. Are there any anything else before we recess for lunch?
Not for the legislative defendant.
Your Honor, not from us.
Nothing from
Okay.
plaintiffs.
All right, since it's now close to 12:15, we'll come back at 1:45 this afternoon, okay? So we'll be in recess until 1:45. Thank you all very